Hello and welcome to Struggle and Resilience on Manhattan's Lower East Side. My name is Cindy Vandenbosch and I'm the founder and president of Turnstile Tours. We are a social enterprise tour company that works in partnership with different nonprofit organizations to document and share stories that are underrepresented in the public record in New York City. We thank you so much for joining us today for this special program that we are hosting along with our partners that include the museum at Eldridge Street, the Reher Center for Immigrant Culture and History, as well as the Lower East Side Partnership. Before we start the program, I would like to introduce those of you that are less familiar with Zoom about how you can communicate with us today and ask questions of the guests that we'll be bringing on. On your screen, if you're using Zoom and you're watching from Zoom, not Facebook, you can click on the chat box and there you'll see two options. One is all panelists, and those questions from all panelists will go to those of us that are behind the scenes. Here at Turnstile Tours, we have Amanda Adler-Brennan, who is our producer today, and she will be fielding those questions in the chat box and sharing them with me to ask of our guests today. If you would like to communicate with everyone that is registered through Zoom, please select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see the stories or memories that are sparked by you or questions that you might have. So again, it's either all panelists or all panelists and attendees, which would go out to everyone. I also would like to invite those of you that would like to use closed captioning that is available to you today, and you just need to click on the closed caption button. If you're logging in from a smartphone or from your iPad, and let's say you already have the captions on the screen, but you do not want them to be on the screen, you'll have to leave and come back. You'll have to leave, change the settings in your phone or iPad to turn off the captions and then come back on. So that is some of the housekeeping things for today. As a tour company, we are obviously not out in the world doing what we do best, which is engaging the public in place and experiencing the stories of different communities across New York City in person. Thankfully, because of so many of you that are out there, you've joined us for these virtual programs. We've now done over 80 of them, and that has helped us stay afloat and continue to support our staff. So we thank you so very much. So I'd like to provide a little bit of a context and an introduction before we bring on our guests today. Struggle and resilience on Manhattan's Lower East Side is our theme. And as I and my co-panelists were preparing for this virtual program, we felt that it would be disingenuous not to kind of look at this moment that we're currently in. So we are experiencing history right now. You know, on one hand, many families are facing health issues. Over the last month, we've had the largest decline in jobs, and the unemployment rate is now at about 14.2% for New York City. Even before this crisis, 1.1 million New Yorkers had food security challenges, and now that's been exacerbated by this crisis. And of course, many of us are worried about rent, both residential rent as well as rent for businesses. And so we're going through a crisis at this very moment. And it's not to say that this program is going to give us a roadmap as we look to the future, but we thought perhaps we could look to the past and really think about how Lower East Side residents have struggled through hard times and what it has meant to get support, whether it's being, you know, in our current crisis, we see that people are being inventive. They're adapting their businesses to make PPE or masks. They're doing whatever they can with the skills and resources to help other people and other residents, even on the Lower East Side. the same was true historically. And so we're going to look at different examples of people not only helping themselves in different ways, in whatever way they can, but how people have helped one another over time. And we'll also be looking at models of charity and philanthropy through various different lenses. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of context, historical context. Sorry, bear with me for just a second here. Sorry, hold on 1 second, one technical issue. So here we are. I'd like to start with a personal story that is shared in the Bintel Brief. So as we all know, the Lower East Side at the turn of the 20th century is this place where you have so many Jewish immigrants especially that have come to settle. It's an unprecedented time of immigration that happens here to the United States, especially from places like Eastern Europe, as well as the Balkans. And many of the Jewish immigrants that are coming, their first home is here, on the Lower East Side. Now, Abraham Kahan started the Jewish Daily Forward in the late 19th century. And part of the Jewish Daily Forward starting in 1906 included the Bintel Brief, which was where Jewish immigrants would write in and sort of ask for help and support in different ways. There's a letter in 1906 where a woman writes in and she says that her husband, she emigrated 19 years before. She had met her husband, and while they didn't have much money through their lives, they were happy. He had a job. And then he comes down with consumption, or what we understand as tuberculosis for the time period. He ends up being very sick. They have 7 children at the time, and the oldest one is only about 13 or 14 years old. He ends up going out to Colorado to try to get fresh air, try to breathe and feel better, but eventually he passes away. And what does she do? She turns to family. So she goes to her sister-in-law, lives at her sister-in-law's tenement apartment for some time, but ends up ultimately having to give up at this point in her letter 4 of her children to an orphanage. And so I share the story because she's dealing with health issues, she's dealing with housing insecurity, and I'm sure it's hard for her to put food on the table. Now, his advice to her is maybe she wants to go back to Colorado, maybe she wants to go to a place where she can get fresh air and not be afraid of getting sick, and hopefully be able to make some money in the longer term. But I bring up her story because it gives kind of a sense of what people were going through at the time. Lower East Siders would have been, and a lot of Jewish immigrants would have been street peddlers and tried to make a living. If they knew how to make pretzels or bread, they might make that in their homes and go sell it out on the streets. And then people also did homework. So here we have models of self-help, of people being inventive. These are a family that's making some paper flowers, and this is a photograph that of course appears in How the Other Half Lives, which was a book that was published with some of the first photographs that many New Yorkers who didn't live on the Lower East Side saw about what the living and working conditions were like in the community. Here we have a cigar making shop. So the idea of home and work life are kind of enmeshed with one another. And then as late as 1912, we have a family and they're embroidering, working in the needle trades. So these are ways through work that people are trying to get by, but in some cases, immigrants, they would, if their family members couldn't help or they couldn't make ends meet, they're turning to one another, and especially people that come from the same town or region. So here we're looking at a building that is a historic site on the Lower East Side. You see the pink and green facade, both on the left side of the image and the right. It's an L-shaped building. And if you look closely at the top, it says Kletzger Brotherly Aid Association, 1892. These were immigrants that had come over from Kletsk, which, back then at that time was in Poland, today is in Belarus. And they pooled together their money and resources so that if someone in their community, in this immigrant community, fell on hard times, they could help out one another. And so it, in the form of burial plots if someone died, and funeral services, food assistance, or even widows. So maybe this woman just didn't have that kind of network. That was the most common form of aid, but we also saw that in some cases, other communities would provide support in time of need. In 1906, there's a pogrom, in 1903, there's a pogrom in Kishinev, which is today in Moldova. And this was the first big pogrom that happened in the 20th century. 49 people died. There had been a death of a child that was wrongly blamed on the Jewish population that lived there. And the Russian authorities allowed just masses of people to go and kill people, and it was a terrible situation. And so there was a Chinese organization in Chinatown that was led by Joseph Singleton that decided to throw a fundraiser and help the Jewish community kind of get through this time and send money back home to so many people whose homes had been damaged or lost, and whose family members had been lost due to this crisis. And in their presentation at this fundraiser, they stated that they really understood where the Jewish immigrants were coming from, because they themselves had been victims to a massacre 2 years before in Blagoveshchensk in the eastern part of Russia, where 5,000 people, Chinese people, especially women and children, had been marched into a river and drowned as part of a type of pogrom in that part of the country. So it was in solidarity that they supported. On another form of relief, and we're gonna see some of this kind of echo in the other presentations that come today, but this is Lillian Wald, and she formed the Henry Street Settlement in the mid-1890s as someone who saw that there was a public health crisis and that all people should have access to healthcare. And so what we see in this quote, and so it starts from a question of public health and concern of public health, but Henry Street Settlement, as part of really what becomes the settlement house movement, becomes a place where immigrants can go to get assistance, but also to help one another, to build a sense of community, and to coordinate even around issues of policy at the time. We can see this quote as late as 1933, where Lillian Wald, while she acknowledges that organized charity relief is important, this quote says that she really thinks that the relief that the poor have given other people who are poor has probably amounted to a much larger amount than what the philanthropists have shared. And last but not least, this brings us up to the 1930s. So our original kind of letter that in 1906, the woman who had to give up her children and who was struggling through these hard times didn't have federal support in the way that by the time the 1930s, the federal government under FDR sets up the New Deal, and now we have more of a government safety net. It's not perfect. If you were not a citizen, which about a third of all residents on the Lower East Side were not citizens, you were not, after 1937, able to gain access to to jobs through the Works Progress Administration, as well as other opportunities. But there was still some form of relief that came into play after most personal and community resources had been exhausted. And so that gives us a little bit of a frame and a picture of sort of what was happening throughout this era in terms of mutual aid and support. But now what we're going to do is, we've zoomed out a little bit here, and now we're going to zoom in with Chelsea Dowell from the museum at Eldridge Street, who is going to share with us how this Jewish congregation, this synagogue that was built on the Lower East Side in the 1880s, served as a place of mutual aid and support. Chelsea,
hi, Cindy.
if you could please join us.
Can you see me?
Great. So thank you so much. Welcome to the program, Chelsea.
Thanks for having me.
Chelsea, I'm going to, can everyone hear Chelsea?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Chelsea, if you would like to share, I'm going to share your slides.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is going to be so interesting.
Thanks a lot. So like Cindy said, I'm Chelsea Dowell, and I'm the Director of Public Engagement at the Museum at Eldridge Street. And I'm going to talk today about charity and community support and community identity through, as Cindy said, the lens of this one specific place, the Eldridge Street Synagogue. And Cindy, you can just go to the next slide. So the synagogue was built in 1887. It's the first great house of worship built by Eastern European Jews in America. So that's kind of a lot of qualifiers. But basically what that means is that this is the first time that this immigrant group that Cindy mentioned that was coming from all over Eastern Europe, kind of flooding the Lower East Side at this time. This is the first time that this group has gained the financial and the social capital to build their own religious building and to have it look exactly the way they want it to. And you can see from these pictures that they really decked it out. The architecture and the design here is a really exuberant expression of their aspirations as new Americans and their freedom to practice their religion openly and proudly, in many cases for the very first time. And so they're really constantly playing with those two identities, as I think if you know anything about sort of immigrant culture in America, is so often the case. They come over and they bring their own customs, but of course they're adjusting those customs to fit within the larger structure of their new country. And they're finding new ways to kind of meld those identities and be a part of both worlds. And the establishment of the synagogue itself is kind of a mix of those two things. The wealthier congregants who were able to put up enough money to build the building, they were certainly engaging in very American ideals of commerce and capitalism and business. They had to take out a mortgage, very American thing to do, to build this building. But it was also a real act of community because they were undertaking this huge project with the goal to serve more people than ever before in the neighborhood. But also, as they were doing that, they're setting up structures within the congregation and within the community to further serve Lower East Siders and other congregants. So we'll talk a little bit about how they set some of those things up. Cindy, you can go to the next slide. And so just to briefly say how we use the building today, the building is a museum, and we offer normally, when we're all back in society, tours that explain or explore immigration history, Lower East Side Jewish culture, and the art, architecture, and restoration of this really beautiful landmark. And through research that we've done, through historic items that were found in the museum during the restoration, as well as congregational records, we really are able to get a very deep sense of these early congregants, who they were, how they used this beloved building of theirs, and also how they interacted with the larger neighborhood and the city as well. Next slide, please. So I mentioned when this building opened in 1887, it was a real community act in and of itself, and it was huge community news. This is the first time that this immigrant group is really putting a stake in the ground in the country, proclaiming that they've arrived and that they have a place of their own to worship and they have a real place in American society. And so because it was such a big deal, it was actually covered in newspapers across the nation. And reporters actually came to the first service to kind of see what was going on here. And so you'll see here that this writer took the time to note the diversity of the congregation. So I had mentioned that there were some wealthy businessmen who kind of got this project off the ground, but more than just them, it served mostly everyday Lower East Siders, people like Cindy, like the people in the pictures that Cindy showed earlier. A lot of low-income families, new immigrants seeking a place in society, kind of trying to figure out how to make their way. And so this building was a real touchstone for them. This was a place where, yes, they could practice their religion, but perhaps more importantly, it was a main touchstone of community. It was a place for them to go to see people who were just like them, to speak their language. Maybe they could find a job there. Maybe they could get assistance with anything that they needed. It was also a place where the wealthy leaders of the congregation, the men who had done well for themselves and put up a lot of the money to start this congregation, where they could continue to remain really connected to the community. We know from the minutes of the congregation that people from the community would often come to the services like you see illustrated here, and they might lobby for the synagogue's support in funding a hospital or a school or a library. And the minutes show that nearly always those requests were granted. So it certainly wasn't some fancy, really opulent synagogue where the wealthy were kind of sealing themselves off from the everyday life and the everyday residents of the neighborhood. But it really was kind of a constant conversation between the community and the congregation and offering that support and the community relief when possible. On the next slide, we see here an artifact that was found in the synagogue during restoration that tells us a lot more about how our congregants saw their responsibility to community and society at large. So this is what we call the tzedakah box at the museum. And this box here is built into the wall, and it allows the congregation to practice tzedakah, which is a Jewish obligation that translates really to an ethical obligation to give charity, to support your community. And our congregations took this really seriously. They really, like I said, relished this opportunity to have a conversation between their Jewish identity and their American lives, and to be a part of a larger society. And so this tzedakah box, it consists of 6 slots that you see up top there. And each one represents the 6 days that the congregants would be permitted and therefore obligated to give charity. No money is changing hands on the Sabbath. So the Saturday is not a part of this, not a part of these slots here. But the slots corresponded to things like supporting the care and repair of Jewish books, funding neighborhood schools, upkeep of cemeteries, and as well, of course, there's a slot for the maintenance of the synagogue itself. But you get a sense here that that the community is really finding aid and support a very essential part of every single day life. And we can go to the next slide. Although the tea box, as we very lovingly call it in the museum, was a really important way that congregants gave back, it certainly wasn't the only way. And on the photo here on the left, you see marble plaques. These line the back wall of the sanctuary of the Eldridge Street Synagogue, and they commemorate the Ladies Auxiliary, which is a group that was founded in 1919 to formalize the charitable work that the women of the congregation had been doing for years and years before that. And on the right, I show here, this is actually a photo of the handwritten minutes of the congregation in Yiddish that formalize the founding of the Ladies Auxiliary. And these handwritten minute books, which we've translated from Yiddish, are incredibly essential to us as a museum as we're trying to understand our early congregants and what they were doing and how they were interacting with the community. So the Ladies Auxiliary had their hands in so many aid and relief efforts in the neighborhood. One of the really impactful things that they did was cook meals for the hungry and the homeless in the neighborhood every Friday and Saturday. They invited them into the synagogue building. This was something that was taken on by the women of the congregation, and it was kind of like an open house. And what I think is really interesting about this is that they not only invited these people in, but they actually went out into the neighborhood and did what they could to spread this message that the open house was available and that people could come and eat food if they needed to. And I think that's interesting because I think a lot of times we think of really observant religious people, maybe especially in the historic context, as being kind of isolated. But here we see that these women, these religious women, were going out into the neighborhood and really getting as many people as they could and bringing them in. And I think that's really interesting. Many people remember these meals as being really high quality food prepared with care, even though I think it was one newspaper article referred to the people who were being served as, quote, Jewish hobos. But this wasn't something that was just kind of slapdash put together. These women put a lot of care into this work, and so it was clearly very important to them. Meals wasn't the only way that they offered support to the community. They also sponsored massive giveaways where hundreds of children a year would get clothes, shoes, and other essentials. And a lot of times this was tied to specific holidays like Passover. That's another way that the congregants here were reaching out to the community and doing anything that they could to help the residents of the neighborhood. And it's reminds me of what Cindy was saying about Lillian Wald's idea that the poor to poor relief is oftentimes the most impactful. And so we certainly see that happening here. If we go to the next slide, then we see that men got involved in community matters too. This is a newspaper headline that talks about an issue of community affairs. So in April 1900, the police in New York City claimed that the moral character of the Lower East Side was beginning to deteriorate and that it was becoming a hotbed for vice and violence. And I think a lot of people at the time would probably not have debated that, but they claimed that the Jewish residents might have been responsible for the bad behavior. And the Jewish residents of the neighborhood had a little something to say about that. And so a group of 800 men came together to debate this fact and to not only debate it, but kind of figure out what they could do about it. How do they improve their neighborhood, and who's responsible for this idea of community wellness? And these 800 men met at Eldridge Street Synagogue. So the building was the largest in the neighborhood. It was seen as a meeting house and as a natural gathering point for the community. And so, as I was saying earlier, the establishment of the synagogue itself was an act of community because it gave residents of the Lower East Side, both religious and not, there's no reason to indicate that these 800 men were all congregants. And so the synagogue was this way to kind of facilitate conversation and a dialogue between members of the community, as well as continue to foster that sense that the congregants here and that religious Lower East Siders did have a place in the larger conversations about the community on the Lower East Side, as well as the city and the country at large. And we'll go to my last slide here, which I just want to finish with another story that I think really shows how large this community was thinking about their identity in the world. So this flag holder here is just inside the top floor of the windows at the sanctuary, and it overlooks Canal Street. These windows overlook Canal Street. and you'll see there's a cutout 5-pointed star or an American star, rather than the 6-pointed star that you might expect to see in a Jewish space. And throughout the sanctuary, there are both of those stars. Just another example of how this congregation is kind of playing with both identities. From these flag holders, the congregation flew flags that were commissioned especially where one star represented each member of the congregation who had a family member fighting in World War I. And I really love this story because I think it perfectly represents how the congregation's view of their community and which communities they belonged to was just constantly kind of broadening. They didn't come to America and kind of close ranks and feel responsible just for their narrow identity as religious Jews, but they really saw their affiliation with the synagogue as a way to continually expand kind of which communities they belonged to and which communities they were responsible for caring for and being a part of. So I think that's kind of a nice way to think about their role in the community and the world.
Absolutely, Chelsea. And we do have someone who's watching named Sharon, who said she misses the egg cream and egg roll, and now empanadas as well, festival, right? Could you share a little bit about what that festival has meant to the community and how you've sought to kind of expand from egg creams and sort of the history of Jewish immigration to include many of the newer immigrant populations that have settled on the Lower East Side?
Yeah, absolutely. So just like we see our historic congregants kind of expanding the communities that they feel responsible for and feel a part of, the museum at Eldridge Street has done the same thing. So we, of course, were in 1887, when they built this building, it was the heart of the Jewish Lower East Side. But things change, and Eldridge Street between Canal and Division is very much a part of Chinatown now. And we really feel like that's an incredibly important piece of both immigration history, but also our identity as a community institution on the Lower East Side. So we really like to talk about that and use the fact that this neighborhood has shifted as a way to talk about immigration and culture and shifting customs in both our neighborhood and the city at large. And our signature festival is the egg creams, the egg rolls, egg creams, and empanadas festival, which unfortunately we've had to postpone until next year. But it really celebrates all these different communities on the Lower East Side and how they come together, and both the customs that they share and the ones that are different and how those kind of interact with each other. And it's such a great day. We're so sad not to be doing it this year, but next year it'll be back and better than ever.
Thank you so much. And for people that want to learn more about the museum at Eldridge Street, they can obviously go to your website, and there's all kinds of stories and resources that people can access.
Yes, eldridgestreet.org.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Chelsea. Don't completely go away, but we're going to bring on Dr. Sarah Litvin next, and then we're going to welcome you back towards the end. Dr. Sarah Litvin has spent many years working on and researching the Lower East Side, and is now the director of a museum that's up in the Hudson Valley. And she has, in her research and time looking at the history of the Lower East Side, became very interested in this topic of mutual aid and philanthropy. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to hear about your case study in reference to struggle and resilience in the neighborhood.
Thank you so much, Cindy, and to you and Chelsea for those amazing presentations that really set up what I'm going to talk about beautifully. When Cindy asked me to be a part of this presentation, I was really excited because the research I'm going to share with you today about aid organizations for the Lower East Side Jewish Blind was really quite formative for me. It's research that I did in my first year of graduate school, and it really made me think differently about what we can learn about people of the past and what we can't. So I'll get into that in a minute, but just before I launch into this, I wanted to share with you a little bit about the work I'm doing now at the Reher Center. So Cindy, if you go on to the next slide. This is it. It's a historic tenement building in Kingston, New York, in the Rondat neighborhood, which was a historically immigrant neighborhood. And what we do is we tell the immigrant stories of the Hudson Valley, past and present, both through the story of the Reher family who donated this building. They were Jewish immigrants and the children of immigrants who operated a bread bakery on this site and lived there for about 100 years. And then we also have a gallery upstairs, which is the only space in the Hudson Valley dedicated to the stories of immigrants to our region, past and present. So this year we're not able to do our guided tours of the historic bakeries. It's so important to be able to break bread together and have sort of intimate conversations about these topics, about immigration and community and work and bread. So we're going to hold off on that for a year. But if you go to the next slide, I'll show you what it is that we will be doing and that I hope you'll be able to join us. Every year, and it's amazing timing that Chelsea just finished with talking about the Egg Roll, Egg Cream, and Empanada Festival, because in Kingston, we every June have a multicultural festival. This year, rather than doing a live streamed event, we decided to create a website, which is Kingstonmulticulturalfestival.org. And this is going to have all kinds of interactive elements that showcase both the performing groups of our region. You can see right there the Ukrainian dance group performing back when we were able to have it, in real life. But we'll have videos of many different groups, language greetings to learn from the different languages of our neighbors here, and a variety of other things, foods from the restaurants. So I hope you'll join us. There's especially a project to create a cultural quilt of the Hudson Valley. And we're encouraging people, whether you're here or not, to create basically a self-portrait in the form of a collaged square, take a picture of it and upload it with the hashtag #CulturalQuiltHV. So you can learn all about this on our website, which is rehercenter.org. And just in case you're coming to the Hudson Valley later on this fall, we're going to have a whole exhibition about the history of sewing in Kingston, the garment industry here. So that'll be up for a full year. So just what you can do virtually before you can get to our site, come to the Multicultural Festival, and then once you're able to come visit, Sewing in Kingston and the bakery tours will be there for you. So that's just a little bit about my work now, but let's go back. And before I actually read you this, I want to tell you how this whole thing started, which is I used to work at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, and I was giving a tour in 2012. And there was a student on my tour who was blind. And the student asked me the simplest question. They just asked, what would life have been like for me? And it was one of those moments where you look at the person and you have to say, I honestly don't know. I mean, I could imagine the challenges that would be, involved with that, but I really didn't know. So when I got to graduate school, I decided in my first year I wanted to find out. And, like any good historian, you start by looking for the numbers, right? So I found out that there was a sizable population of blind Jewish New Yorkers in the early 20th century. There were 1,746, according to the 1900 census. And in 1915, it was reported there were 500 blind Jews among the citizens of New York City. So one thing to say, and this is important, is the category of blind is kind of tricky in thinking about in that time or this, because it catches people who are born blind or low vision, people who suffer or experience blindness later on as a result of an industrial accident or old age. So it's a very broad category to begin with. And at that time, the Jewish population was especially concerned with the growing numbers and the visible population of Jewish New Yorkers who were blind, because it was connected so closely with fears about their status in America. And Chelsea sort of mentioned some of this before. There was anxiety about being visibly Jewish. Will we be accepted? Will we not? And with the large population of poorer immigrants coming from Eastern Europe at the turn of the 20th century, this really became quite concerning for folks. Of course, some of these people did have diseases. Some of them did not, but there was a real fear of the perception. So I convinced my professor this was a worthy topic to study. And then I turned to my sources to find out kind of what I could. Okay, what was life like? So here's what I find, right? For the tenement blind, a pleasantly informal concert at the Educational Alliance, which was a settlement house on the Lower East Side. The blind of the tenements are a class by themselves, far more helpless and dependent than those who have been in institutions. Dressed in the bright calicos of their native countries, some perhaps with heavy gold enameled earrings, they sat huddled in little groups with shawls over their heads, patiently waiting for the music. This was like, whoa, this was a red flag to me, because how am I possibly going to understand what the lives of Lower East Siders are like if the only descriptions I have are ones like this that are about pitying this population who are seen as so other? So it took me quite a while to finally give up on this idea. I mean, I think it's so fascinating what Chelsea showed with us, the meeting minutes from the people who had access to that institution to be able to write what they were doing. But for the blind Jewish population at the Lower East Side, there are very few voices from those people that remain. So I really had to give up on that idea that I could recover what life was like. And instead I pivoted to saying, who were the people who were describing them, right? And it was mostly reformers, people who had the intention to help. And what can the identity of those people help us to understand about mutual aid, ideas of philanthropy, and what that means in a broader sense about how people help each other and what ways are helpful and what ways are maybe not. So that's what I want to tell you a little bit about in the time that I have remaining. I'm going to tell you about 3 different organizations that Jewish people in New York created to assist the Jewish blind population. And we'll look at who the founders of these were and what this might tell us to kind of complicate the idea of mutual aid. So go on, Cindy, thank you. So the first organization was the National Council of Jewish Women's Committee on the Blind, which was founded in 1907. What you're seeing here is the Chronicle of Joshua Pisa and His Descendants, which was a book published about the family of Anita Pisa, who was the first chairwoman of this committee and really became a hugely influential advocate within this organization to create services to support the Jewish blind. So the National Council of Jewish Women was what it sounds like. It was a national effort of Jewish women to help support and fundraise for a variety of different issues. And Anita Pisa was the one who said every single council in the country should take on this topic of the Jewish blind. And how did she propose to do so? Through a project of friendly visits, so that people would go and visit people who are blind in their homes, through a concert series. And in fact, that description from the New York Times was about a group of people who were gathered to hear a concert for the Jewish blind at the Educational Alliance, and through fundraising in order to give direct relief. So one of the things that I think is so interesting about this model, which is really kind of an archetypical model of 19th century charity, is that in order to fundraise, right, there is an incentive to show that these people are helpless and pitiable. So Anita Pisa thinks that in helping to cultivate that image, she's going to be able to help these people by getting them money. And I just think that that's a kind of an interesting first model to share with you. So just by way of closing this piece, she was remarkably successful. I mean, she did get councils in every branch, or committees in every branch of the National Council. And by the 1920s, she founded a separate spin-off organization that focused solely on New York's blind Jews. It was called the Guild for the Jewish Blind, and that organization actually still exists today, though its name and its approach have changed considerably. It's called the Lighthouse Guild, and it's headquartered on West 64th Street. So we can go on to the next one, which is quite a different model of philanthropy. And this was the Hebrew Association for the Blind, which was founded in 1914 by a man named Benjamin Berenstein, who's the gentleman on the back on the far right of this photo. And he was a man who was blind since his youth. This is his high school yearbook picture. And he, after graduating from Rochester East High School, he actually went to Columbia Law School, and he graduated summa cum laude in 1912. and could not find a job. So he opened his own law firm and shortly thereafter founded an association for the blind. And what he wanted to do was to bring to the public not only the needs of people who are blind, but also the capabilities of people who are blind. Here's a quote from him, quote, "For once the blind themselves should initiate and direct the movement in order that their ideas could be put to practical use." So what does he want to do? He wants to create Braille reading materials and a recreational space for blind Jews to congregate. If you go on to the next slide, you can see here is the, there we go. Here is a photograph that was taken of one of the recreational spaces that this organization created. It was called the Rooftop for the Jewish Blind, and it was actually built up on the top of the Bank of the United, what's it called? Yeah, the Bank of the United States, which was on Delancey Street. So right in the heart of the Lower East Side, super visible, high atop a building. Of course, there were high walls that were built around it, and there were benches, and there were card games and Braille newspapers. And significantly, Benjamin Berenstein, or somebody from the organization, got the news service to come and photograph this, right? So look how very different this depiction of blind Jews is from the one that appeared in the New York Times, right? Here, these men are well dressed. They are looking, well coiffed. They are out in society, not foreign and destitute. So his organization was only around, I think, for 4 years. It then sort of disappears from the record. But I think this offers another really interesting example of an organization and an approach and a way of presenting what it meant to be a blind Jewish New Yorker at the time. Just as an aside, I don't know, and you can go on to the next slide, Cindy, because there's one more photo to show. I could not find evidence that these photos were ever published. So that's another piece of this that's sort of fascinating, but at least they were taken. Let's go on to the last organization I want to talk about now. And this is the Bureau of Philanthropic Research. So this was an organization that was founded in 1916 to build a national philanthropic campaign, not to build a national philanthropic campaign, nor to empower and organize blind Jews to change their own lives, but, quote, to study the underlying causes of existing social ills with a view to suggesting preventative measures. So even there in their kind of mission statement, you can hear how their approach is supposedly scientific, right? They're all about collecting evidence and making recommendations. The organization was founded by these kind of philanthropic giants of New York, and they hired 3 newly trained social workers, sisters actually, named Florina, Etta, and Lula Lasker, in order to do this research. The sisters, 2 years later, published a 108-page report called Care and Treatment of the Jewish Blind in the City of New York. So it's kind of fascinating to read through their report because part of it is about their assessment of the problems, quote unquote, of the Jewish blind. And a large part of it is also about their problems with the other efforts that Anita Pisa and Benjamin Berenstein have been trying to make, right? They see efforts of charity or of self-support as being short-sighted, not connected to the larger ideas about how change ought to be made or what other organizations are out there. For example, the Laskers suggest that they should that the Jewish community should step back. And Cindy had mentioned at the beginning in her talk how the government was taking a larger role in assisting populations who were in need. And so the Lasker sisters are saying, hang on, like we don't need to do so many different things. We should focus our efforts on certain tasks and leave others for other organizations and larger structures to help. So that gives you kind of a little sense of 3 very different types of mutual aid that came from 3 very different people who wanted to try to help. And just by way of closing, I think oftentimes people think about mutual aid as one thing, right? That people are trying to help the people within their community. Well, all of these people were in the Jewish community, but they had very different approaches to how to help. And that kind of timeline also, being a historian, we always have to talk about change over time. Folks often think about how charity then gave way to newer forms of social scientific research and policy recommendations. But what I found in this study is just within 10 years, between 1908 and 1918, all three of these models were happening simultaneously, just in this one tiny little neighborhood in this one very small population. So thanks.
Oh, it's such an interesting kind of examination of a community that I'm sure is really underrepresented in research and in the historic record for the reasons you outlined. We do have a question from Karen that you may or may not know the answer to, but she asked, in 1918, were there still only 500 blind Jews?
So actually, it's funny you ask, because in 1918, there was a population survey of the Jewish community of New York. And I'm pretty sure they found there was one blind Jew for every 1,200 Jews. Let me see if I can find it in my larger paper, and I'll get back.
All right. And we also have Kylie, who says, incredible presentation, thank you. So there was also some discussion back and forth about where the Reher Center is located. It's in the Hudson Valley, it's in Kingston, right?
Correct, yes, in the downtown Rondout neighborhood of Kingston.
Okay, great. So I thank you so much, Sarah. Don't totally go away, but we're going to welcome on our final guest and then bring you guys all back for a final question about where we're headed in the future. But I would like to, as our final kind of guest and speaker, bring on Nina Lashavo, who is the creative lead at the Lower East Side Partnership, and she's now going to bring us up to the present. So this is an organization that has been working on the ground, kind of bringing together, doing its best to respond to needs in the community. And so she's going to share sort of a contemporary perspective, introduce us to the organization, and also give us some insight into what she's seen are the needs in the community and how her organization, the Lower East Side Partnership, has responded in recent months.
Hi, Cindy. Thanks for having me.
Hi, thank you. Welcome to the program.
Hope everybody can hear me well. I want to just quickly talk about the Lower East Side Partnership and what we are and what we do. The Lower East Side Partnership is a business improvement district. There's about 75 or now more business improvement districts in New York City. They focus a lot on economic development, which can be anything from small business services like marketing, neighborhood beautification, things like plantings, public space, things like street seats, sanitation, keeping our district clean, and partnerships with other city organizations. So Lower East Side Partnership was actually founded in 1992. And most recently, obviously, we're doing a lot of work as it pertains to the needs of our community and what's going on with COVID-19. So,
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'm just pulling this up here. If you could share a little bit about what you're seeing. Obviously, sort of food is a major concern right now on the Lower East Side, and we are going to do a program together in a couple of weeks with a researcher from Columbia who's looking at these issues around food access and COVID-19, because you speak a little bit to how you've been responding to that need as an organization.
I think that would, if you mind just going 2 slides forward.
Sure.
One more.
Right here.
Yeah. So with our partnership with the Essex Market, we're dealing a lot with food access. Currently, in partnership with the Essex Market, we do a lot of marketing and promotions for them, as well as programming. A lot of our programming is typically in person in our demonstration kitchen, where we welcome a lot of seniors in our community for free programming, where they learn about nutrition and food education, and they come in and they get coupons for shopping at the Essex Market, and they're able to really sort of engage in the community and really, be able to get out and also get fresh food. So, something that we just launched about a month ago is this program where we've partnered already with CPC, the Chinese Planning Council, and we delivered over 100 grocery bags of fresh food to the houses where these elderly are currently right now. And we'll be partnering with the Grand Street Settlement starting next month, where we'll be bringing these groceries, more donations essentially. And we're still accepting donations at essexmarket.nyc/donate. That pertains a lot to food access and how people have a need. These seniors are homebound. They can't quite get out yet. It'll be a while before it's truly safe for them to come out. And they don't really have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So it's super important.
Yeah, it's such a huge issue. And I know from speaking to you and others on the Lower East Side that there is a great need, more so than we've seen before the pandemic even started. Now, I know that there were also efforts that the Lower East Side Partnership made right at the beginning of the pandemic. Could you speak a little bit more to how you brought together different resources in order to help with the emergency kind of relief efforts and frontline workers?
Yeah, sure. We could go back just 2 slides there. So through our program, Lower East Side Relief, we gave over 3,500 meals to frontline workers, FDNY, NYPD, and EMS that were basically in responding to COVID-19 in our community. And it was really important for us to get our small businesses involved. A lot of small businesses are obviously struggling right now. A lot have closed or on very limited scheduling and are unable to really put out, make the profit, that they were before. So this was a way for us to get involved and sort of help them turn a profit and make sure that when we were reaching out to them, they could, of course, help frontline workers, but they can also, do a bulk catering order that's really going to help their business or boost them for, a period of time. So we raised over $10,000 locally from our community. And we were able to also match that from our organization so that we can have the program go for 30 days. So that was 30 days of meals for our frontline workers, as well as over 30 small businesses that were able to participate and give food.
And that's incredible too, right? Because you have all of these relationships with businesses and restaurants that are on the Lower East Side that you were able to bring into this effort in order to feed people and help sustain their small business, which is a big challenge for many small business owners right now, is how do they stay relevant and how do they stay active?
Right, especially this occurred from about April 1 through to April 30, roughly. So that was a time where people were really sheltering in place and there was less takeout happening. So it was very helpful for people to have at least 1 or 2 big sales.
Yeah, I mean, with the unemployment numbers, some of the highest percentages are people that are working in hospitality or leisure. And so to be able to support our restaurants and our small businesses is so essential. Could you give just a little bit of a broader context about the LES partnership in terms of how you're positioned and the relationships that you have as you think about your role today and as you look to the future?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're trying to provide people with information and the services that they truly need to get by during this time as that pertains to small businesses. And really trying to understand the CARES Act and what has sort of come to be of these loan programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, the Emergency Economic Injury Grant, really understanding if your business qualifies for these programs and also where you can get grants and even some, private funding if you're having trouble making ends meet, obviously. And we put together a series of webinars to sort of go through that, give people some access to pro bono legal support, as well as we were in touch with Congresswoman Maloney and the Small Business Association, SBA, who puts together these loan programs and does a lot of the approval processes through the bank. And therefore, people were able to have an open Q&A with these people and really get an understanding of, how they can access these funds or how they can become capable to access these funds and also get pro bono legal help for their business, which is something that, they likely didn't have any sort of financial assistance to get in the beginning. And it's almost like you have to be financially equipped in order to get financial assistance, which is a huge problem that, we've seen. So really sort of connecting our, relationships in government local government, and our resources that we could give and sort of give back to the community in that way, and also just be kind of open and available. For example, even just putting our email addresses and our phone numbers on our website so that businesses could really just reach out to someone if they needed to chat about it and get them connected to the right people.
And I'm just putting up this slide one more time for people who might be interested in helping people gain access to groceries that are on the Lower East Side. And this also goes to support local grocers, right? So that the funding is grocers that are in the Essex market are able to generate some income when you make this donation.
Right, absolutely. So we have several grocers within the Essex market, and we'll be partnering with most, if not all of them, in order to put these bags together, as well as some essential pantry items that will be going in as well. Even sort of hearing the requests that we think that these seniors need, and even specifying what's going to be going inside those bags so people really can have, a set amount of groceries and food for a period of time.
Wow. So thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in the community. And I'd like to welcome all of our guests back on for just a final question, and then we're going to close out the program. But I guess the question I'd like to ask to each one of you, coming from your research and from your perspective in institutions, is kind of what do you hope we as a community and society will how do you hope that we'll come out of this crisis, and how it might shape the neighborhood as we look to the future? So I don't know if Chelsea, if you would like to kick us off, like based on kind of this moment in history, and you're thinking about the past and about Eldridge Street Synagogue. What is your kind of hope for the future as we look back to this current time and what we learned from it?
Yeah, thanks, Cindy, and thanks everyone for such great presentations. I'm so glad to have been a part of it. I think the question is a really interesting one because I might have thought differently 3 days ago than I do now. Things seem like they're happening so fast, and there's like some kind of compounding issues happening right now all over the world, certainly in New York. I think for me, when I think about what we can learn from it, it seems so important to assume responsibility for everyone as a member of our own communities, to sort of see ourselves as part of something so much larger than just our own very narrow experience of the world. And I think right now to realize that just because you or your household isn't necessarily hurting right now doesn't mean that there aren't so many people who are, and who need that support and who deserve that support, just like you would if you were in such a situation. So I think just that sort of expanding our own sense of who we are and our identity and the communities we're involved in will really go so far to just lift all boats, I guess.
Yes, thank you so much, Chelsea. And I also wanted to bring up that there was some conversation in the chat box about the museum at Eldridge Street. And it is in normal times, it would be a place that you could go and see exhibits and learn about some of the stories and see much of what you shared with us today. And could you please provide us just with a little bit of update? If people want to virtually visit, they can go to your website right now, and you're doing some programs. Mm-hmm. And hopefully in the near future, the museum itself will be reopening to the public. Is that right?
Yes, we cannot wait until that time has arrived. But in the meantime, we're at eldridgestreet.org. We're doing some virtual programs. And there's lots of information on the website so you can start to learn more about the Eldridge Street Synagogue and its congregants and our building. And we're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, so follow us there. And then you'll be the first to know when we're reopened and we can welcome people back in real life.
Great, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining the program. Sarah, in terms of this question about thinking about history and the moment we're in, what kind of perspective do you have on this, where we're headed and how we'll look back?
I think it's like the perfect follow-up to Chelsea's, which is to then just say how hard that is to do, because people, even within one population, come from such different places and bring such different sources of authority, right? And so I think this idea of privilege, right? And where does your privilege come from, and how are you able to sort of navigate through and around that in your efforts to help other people, I think is really one of the biggest takeaways for me. None of these people were bad, right? They were all trying to help, but they had such different backgrounds and such different understandings of what was needed and of what their role ought to be. And I think figuring out how to be self-aware and ask others about where they're coming from is one of the most important things we can do.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess that sort of feeds in to Nina, the work that you guys are doing on the ground, trying to assess needs and understand where people are. Is it hard for you to kind of extract yourself from this current moment and what you're working on day to day to kind of think about what as we look back, we might think of what we might learn from just being in it at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult to think about what we'll truly feel when we look back, when we're, out of this in a year or however long it's going to be. But that I do hope that we can take from it that the Lower East Side is a very strong neighborhood with a very diverse community. And our community is supportive of one another. They have a lot of pride. They care about the history of the community, everything from its local institutions to the buildings that have been here to spaces that have been here. And I really do think that seeing these fundraisers get activated so quickly and seeing the average donations being, $25 or $30 and still be able to get up, over 10,000, over 5,000 just shows that there are so many locals here that are paying attention to the conversations that people are having and the struggles that, everyone is sort of enduring at this time and how we can mobilize and be together to help one another. So hopefully we'll see that when we look back.
And I'd like to share with all of you that we have a very nice comment from Hugo, who's watching. He said he was glad to see that all the presenters were women, smart and dedicated women. So thank you, Hugo. We appreciate that. And so I just thank you so much to all of you for joining us. This is the last day. I should have said this in the intro. It's the last day of Lower East Side History Month, which is what prompted this whole program in the first place. But do stay in touch. We will, as I mentioned, have a academic researcher coming on to discuss how we've ended up where we are in terms of food access and issues around food security. So she's going to provide that historical context in just a couple of weeks. So stay tuned to all of the Turnstile Tours website, the LES partnership as well. And we're also going to put a contemporary spotlight on how different organizations are responding to those food needs. So we'll be doing both historical, kind of a look at the past as well as a look at the present. And then for those of you that are not familiar with Turnstile Tours programming, we hope you'll join us for some other programs. We do this every day at 11 a.m. Tomorrow morning, we will have accessibility advocates. So we'll have Ruth Bernstein from the Hearing Loss Association of New York. She's on the board there speaking with us, as well as an autism advocate, Michael John Carley. We will also hear from a representative of the Andrew Haskell Braille and Talking Book Library, which is part of the New York Public Library that really assists and supports people who are blind in New York City. And we will also have, and that's Nefertiti, who's from the library. And then our last guest is Meredith Wong, and she works for Caring Kind, which provides support to people with memory loss and their caregivers. So we're going to be hearing from them about how these communities and the people that they're interacting with are coping, especially with the shift from in-person interactions to virtual interactions, and where we see this taking us in the future. On Tuesday, we're going to have on our guest will be Mary Habstritt from the Lilac Preservation Project, and she'll be talking to us about maritime navigation. And then on Wednesday, we'll be going live to La Marqueta, to the Urban Garden Center, to talk community gardening and also get some gardening tips from the family that's operated that for many generations. And 2 more programs Thursday. Artist Steph Mansis is going to come on and talk about art and pizza. She comes from a pizzeria family, and so she's also an artist, and so she'll be talking about her projects and process. And on Friday, we'll have historian Julie Golia, who oversaw the creation of the waterfront exhibit at the Dumbo location for the Brooklyn Historical Society, and she'll be taking us on a deep dive into the story of dock worker Michael Harkins and how she uncovered his story. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We couldn't do these virtual programs without you, and we hope everyone stays safe and healthy during this challenging time, and that you have people that you know that you can turn to for support. And also that, much like what we've discussed, trying to understand what those needs are and how all of us can do something to help our neighbors and help people even that we don't know that may be struggling through difficult times. So stay in touch with all of our organizations and have a nice afternoon.